Hello, so I'm Caleb Gardner and I'll be speaking on Would We Really Starve Without Aquaculture? When I proposed this talk, it was as a poster, and it was something I thought would be a good conversation topic. So hopefully, if you're interested, it's something which we could talk about in the future. Now, the reason I proposed this talk was because every aquaculture conference I've been to, there's always been talks or several talks which people emphasize or claim the value of aquaculture in terms of feeding the world. There's often a fairly standard formula to presentations, and a lot of them go along the lines of something like this. They'll start with saying that wild fish stocks are fully exploited and there's no scope for increasing production from wild fisheries. And then they'll look at trends in population and talk about the way that the world's population is growing, and therefore there needs to be more food produced to feed all these people. And then inevitably this plot from the FAO is shown, which shows that the last couple of decades has involved pretty flat levels of production from wild capture, and in contrast aquaculture production has increased rapidly, and thank goodness that has occurred, otherwise the world wouldn't have had enough seafood to eat, and aquaculture is sort of therefore feeding the world. And so once we've established that aquaculture has this sort of solid moral foundation for existing and is providing such service to humanity, the aquaculture talks inevitably tend to then lead on to say, well, therefore aquaculture research is important, or government should give more access to waterways for aquaculture developments, or just even simply the public should like aquaculture and should be supportive of expansion in that area. And look, to be honest, I think all labs around the world involved in fisheries and aquaculture like to play this card, that the work we do is critical for feeding the world. This is from my laboratory, it's from the centre I lead, and so our second research priority in our strategic plan talks about using aquaculture to provide food security. Okay, but honestly, we tend to draw a bit of a long bow with this stuff. So these are the species which we work on in my lab. So we have Atlantic salmon, oysters, rock lobsters, all fantastic research, very creative, clever research, providing economic benefits to the community in terms of production of these products. But it's clearly drawing a long bow to say that we're contributing to food security with these and helping feed the world. You know, no one's ever starved for lack of a high quality oyster entree at a restaurant. So there's the premise of the talk. Aquaculture is clearly economically important. It's clearly important for creating economic benefits, particularly in regional areas. Aside from just creating jobs, it also creates food options for consumers. But what about this other big claim that's so often made with aquaculture? Is it really important for food security? Would the world really be starving without this expansion in aquaculture? Okay, so you can see down the bottom, the blue category has been stable through time, whereas a lot of the other categories have been increasing. For example, that yellow category up the top has really grown in levels of production over the last couple of decades. Now, what I didn't tell you at the start of this slide is what it's about. It's actually not seafood, which I guess most people would have assumed. In fact, it's about cars. So the blue category down the bottom is production of vehicles in the USA, which you can see has been stable. And in contrast, production of vehicles in other countries and around the world, for example, Japan and China and Korea, has been increasing tremendously over the last couple of decades. So why am I showing you plots of car production? So I'm showing you production information on vehicles because just to illustrate the point that people think about production of seafood very differently to what they do at other products that are traded. So with vehicles, nobody would look at that production information on cars and go, well, the United States has clearly reached their full capacity of producing vehicles and there's no way they could increase, and just thank goodness other countries have started to produce cars, otherwise there wouldn't be enough cars in the world. Everyone would look at that information in contrast and go, well, there's clearly some competitive advantage for countries who have been able to expand versus the ones who have been stable through time. It may be cost of labour or it may be technology, but there's something going on in the market there, and it's not just limits on supply. So could that same sort of economic thinking help us to understand patterns that are occurring in seafood? So here's what's been happening in terms of supply and demand in seafood. Supply has been doubling around every 25 years, while demand has been, through population growth, has been doubling around every 100 years. So we've got an increase in supply at around 4 times the rate of increase in demand through population growth. This is not a situation that would suggest scarcity. In fact, it suggests really quite the opposite. What it suggests is that there's probably really tough operating conditions for anyone who is a producer of seafood. Okay, so if we're seeing these fairly large shifts in supply and demand in the seafood market through time, and if I'm putting forward this hypothesis that means that the growth in supply is much greater than the growth in demand, and therefore operating conditions are really tough for producers, and therefore that might be the reason why wild catch production isn't growing. Well, this is something we can actually sort of test or at least examine in more detail by looking at price. Because if supply and demand are changing in such a way that it's tough conditions for producers, then we should see that signal coming through in price. And here we go. This plot shows changes in price of around 30 different categories of food in Australia. They've been adjusted for inflation, so what you're seeing here is real price through time. 3 of these categories have declined in real price through time, and one of those categories is seafood. So here is a signal from price that the operating conditions for producers have become really tough through time. This is an operating environment for producers where we would not expect to see increasing production. Despite that, we still have aquaculture producers who are indeed increasing production, but it really shouldn't come as a surprise that wild fisheries producers are struggling if we've got declining real price in seafood through time, because growth in supply is outstripping growth in demand by such a rapid rate. Now, going back to the vehicle production analogy, I think everyone understands that factories generally can increase production, or at least you can build new factories. And this is one of the sort of elements of this discussion which where perhaps seafood is different. See, people might say, well, wild fisheries production really has reached its limits, and so you can't just build another lobster fishery. There is only one of them, for example. Okay, so this point's really critical. Can you really increase production in wild fisheries? Aren't the stocks really fully utilised? Typically, this is where this plot from the FAO normally comes into discussion. It shows the change, or at least the proportions of stocks that are classed as overfished, fully fished, or underfished. And so people will look at this and say, well, most of the stocks here are overfished and fully fished, and there's evidence that there's no scope for increasing production of wild catch. But is that really true? I don't think this plot does show that stocks or production from wild catches can't be increased. You see this category of 70% or so of stocks that are classed as being right at their limit and fully exploited and producing their maximum levels. Well, I've worked on fisheries for a couple of decades, and I don't think I've ever come across a stock yet that I believe is really optimally managed, where there's not opportunities for making changes in the size limits or the seasons of fishing or some of the other regulations, and it wouldn't be possible to improve production and improve operations. And aside from just changes in management as well, there are so many things that can be done in most fisheries, all fisheries I think that I've ever been worked on. So you can reduce the waste. We could redirect production away from animal feeds to human production. We could switch some of the objectives of management rather from generally the ones I've been involved with, target MEY. We could switch those towards trying to maximise the sustainable catch. There are all these things that could be done in that category. That 70% is not really fully utilised. Likewise, the stocks that are classed as overfished, does it really mean they can't be producing anymore? It doesn't. In fact, overfished stocks by very definition are ones that could have got potential for having higher levels of production. And lastly, just this other category, this 5% or tiny amount of stocks that are classed as being underfished. Well, I'd like to explore that one in a little bit more detail. The thing about fish or seafood, of course, is it's not just a single product. There are many different categories. So some of our fish stocks clearly are highly profitable, and those ones are the ones which tend to be pushed right up towards their limits of production, albeit with all these caveats around the levels of management involved. There are some other stocks like orange roughy that are desirable, but the cost of production is high, and so we have stocks in Australia of orange roughies that the producers just don't bother harvesting. It's just not profitable. And then there are other species like this ocean jacket, which are low price and fairly expensive to catch as well, and so they're not fully exploited either. So there's all different categories of seafoods, and some of them can be targeted to fairly high levels or desirable, and they'll be targeted, and other ones are less so. But what I wanted to go through, or perhaps make the point is that it's really easy to think of stocks out there that can be harvested and not just underfished, but are just not really fished at all. Some of these might surprise you. This is skipjack tuna. So Australia has not caught any of its skipjack stocks for well over a decade now, and we know there's large stocks out there, and we know that because producers just across our territorial waters on the other side of the boundary, who have got lower costs of labour and other aspects of their business, are able to harvest these profitably, and so they catch them. This is Australian salmon. There's negligible catch of this taken anymore for human consumption, but 20 years ago the last cannery closed, and earlier than that we had dozens of canneries around southern Australia harvesting these for human consumption, and stocks of these are as good as they've ever been. These are sardines. We have a fishery for Australian sardines in one jurisdiction that takes 30,000 tonnes. There are similar levels of stocks available in many other jurisdictions, but they're just not profitable to harvest. These are myctophids. There's enough biomass of myctophids globally to supply all the world's seafood consumption needs. They're just expensive to catch and not particularly desirable, or far from desirable, honestly, to eat. But we could eat them if we needed to. This one might surprise you. It's a meal I had in Qingdao. It's zooplankton, nice enough to eat, but it's something which we could be harvesting more of if we wanted to, but we don't. Another highly abundant species, these are spider crabs from southern Australia, huge biomass, but just no market demand, so we don't catch those. And sea anemone is another example from another meal I had. Not my favourite seafood, I've got to say, but interesting, and just another edible product where demand isn't that high, and so we don't harvest them. So the point about all of these, though, these are all examples that are not included in the FAO data. They're not the underfished, but they are the unfished. We don't they're not caught at all. They don't even make it into these sort of plots from the FAO. So it's not hard to think of examples like this of fish stocks that are just not being, or seafood that's out there but just not being harvested commercially, and it doesn't even get registered. And why aren't we harvesting these? Simply because aquaculture at the moment is supplying product that's nicer to eat and cheaper, so it's better value. Here's a picture of a tilapia, very cheap and a beautiful eating fish, so why would we eat some of those other examples I've just shown you? And so this is the same sort of thing, coming back to the vehicles example or analogy. On the left, we've got a Holden Commodore. We stopped producing those in Australia because of just competitive advantages, and so now we're importing this Kia, it happens to be. It's lower price and better value. And it's the same process that's driving some of these patterns between wild catch and aquaculture. So to wrap it up, aquaculture is clearly important economically, and it's clearly important growth industry for many regions, and so that has all sorts of benefits. So this is talking not at all as to disparage aquaculture, and it's not only good for the producer side. Aquaculture is increasing consumer welfare as well. It's supplying great product, but really these claims that aquaculture is necessary for food security really just does seem to be hyperbole. So that's where I will leave it, apart from to say thank you very much.